Okay, so everyone, this is Amy Lee. She's been our great partner in building out Common Ground. Amy, let me give you the framing of where they are, so you'll know how to present. They've heard me talk about strategy engine and wicked problems, and we've done a strategy engine on mountain breeze expanding into Brazil, and it's not going well. What do we think? And I told them that your part of this story is really the first part. So they heard the second part first, and now they're hearing the first part second. So this is your show to talk about Kettering, what it does, how it works, and where Common Ground fits into that. And you're being projected, and I will relay any audience comments. And
Okay,
thank you so much for being here.
absolutely. Luke, real fast, how much time do you want me to take, and should we leave any time for questions?
We've got a half hour, plus or minus a couple of minutes for questions.
Sure, sounds good. Okay, well, so it sounds like if Luke has showed you a strategy engine, then you guys have seen Empire Strikes Back, and now I get to do the Star Wars part of this afternoon for you. So that's exciting. First of all, let me say that it's very nice to be with you all. My name is Amy Lee. I'm a program officer at the Kettering Foundation. And if we do happen to have any kind of technical problems or any freezing up or anything, just kind of let me know and I will try to back up. I'm glad that Luke was able to cover wicked and adaptive problems and that you guys have actually had an experience using the strategy engine platform, which is modeled very closely on the Common Ground for Action platform that we developed with Conteneo for use by citizens on public policy problems and problems that they face. So let me back up at the actual beginning and talk a little bit about this collaboration with Conteneo, which has been so wonderful and which I think has turned out a really amazing product that is being speedily adapted through not only the existing network of engaged citizens that Kettering and National Issues Forums and the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation know about, but which we also have great hope for expanding into the population at large. So, again, I'm Amy Lee, and I work at the Kettering Foundation, which is an operating research organization that looks to help solve solve the problem of what it takes to make democracy work as it should. And by democracy, we don't necessarily mean governments and elections. What we mean are citizens, communities, and institutions that are able to solve problems that they face. And I met Luke at South by Southwest when he was talking about how he saw the budget games experiment that he had done with San Jose being a way to bridge the disconnect between what citizens are actually capable of deciding if they're in a good, proper structure for it and what policymakers need to know in order to make sounder decisions. And this disconnect is very much a feature of all the kinds of problems that Kettering works with communities to help them solve. The disconnect between people and policymakers, as well as other institutions, and also lack of citizen engagement are the big problems that Kettering works and finds to be very endemic amongst wicked or adaptive problems. So the term wicked or adaptive problems is probably fairly familiar to business folks. It actually comes out of the field of planning. And Kettering, particularly when we're talking about public policy problems, has a very similar but maybe just slightly unique definition. Basically, that it involves competing things held valuable, wicked problems do. You can't do all of everything. There's no right answer. It's a should question, depending on the group of decision makers involved. But whatever decision is made will require action by a broad range of people, much more than kind of the traditional people you might think of in a regular stakeholder analysis. So obviously, these problems are difficult. So Kettering has had some success working with communities and citizens over about 30 years with the National Issues Forums in in-person forums to help people address these problems. And what we found are the most crucial parts of that are a framework for decision making that kind of gives people a starting point, and then also a way of talking. We knew quite a lot about this in person. They've been doing in-person forums for about 30 years. And for the group of people who are able to come to these, they're very often transformative experiences in terms of people coming to see a role for themselves as active and engaged citizens. But it's also a fairly small, select population of folks who can actually make the time and are desirous of going to those kind of in-person forums. And we knew that with more and more conversation about politics and policy issues taking place online, that we needed to be in that space if we wanted to address some of our problems of scale, even though we know there are other contributing factors to the disconnect between policymakers and citizens than simply scale. But we thought this was a good place to start. So that is why we created Common Ground for Action with Luke and Conteneo. Now the question of why we created Common Ground for Action the way we did, let me talk a little bit about that. So if you, as you noticed, playing Strategy Engine, that it's basically a mix of three elements: the content, the particular problem that you're working on addressing, the structure of the platform itself, how you start by doing individual evaluations and the group comes together and is able to see some of the information about starting points and further refine that, put it all together at the end and see where there is common ground. And then it's also handled by a moderator to help make sure that the kind of talk that's necessary is actually, engaged in by the participants. And the reason we designed it this way is so that it could be used not only for the particular kind of folks who like to go to national issues forums, but so that it could work for any problem, for any wicked problem that had been framed in a deliberative way. Any problem that requires all those things, a framework where there are competing things held valuable, people have to wrestle with tensions and trade-offs, and people are looking for common ground. This platform provides an easy way for people to engage that way. And so the idea is that it's not only useful for a particular audience of people, but that it could be adapted by any number of community problem solvers and citizen engagement groups. So let me talk a little bit about the key elements of Strategy Engine and Common Ground for Action that you probably noticed, and just talk about why we think those are so crucial. So the key elements of Common Ground for Action are, I think, the first two are trade-offs and tensions, and then finally common ground. You'll notice that there's a big deal that you have to do when you are examining each option, and each option is basically based on a concern that citizens have identified about an issue that's identified through research done directly with citizens. And basically the option becomes the strategy for dealing with that, and the actions are the tactics for accomplishing that. But each one, as well as the option as a whole, will have a trade-off. And a trade-off is different than just a cost or a disadvantage. It's the inherent thing that you have to give up because there are tensions between the different values in play in any wicked problem. So a traditional or a classic example of this that you guys may be running into if you have to go to an airport over the holidays this year might be that between security and freedom. We'd like to be really, really safe as we're traveling and making sure that we're avoiding any possibility of risk, whether it's through security at airports or other kinds of police work afterwards. There's a cost in security there's a cost in freedom in order to have greater security. And where you'll fall on how you would balance those competing priorities depends on your lived experience, which is why Common Ground for Action forums try to get people talking in terms of their lived experience and their views rather than arguing over facts and talking points. And the second key feature of Common Ground for Action and Strategy Engine is the Common Ground stage, which I think has two big wins for participants. And this was actually an innovation that exists in the platform in Common Ground for Action and Strategy Engine that doesn't exist in current in-person NIF forums or in lots of, I think, other kinds of community decision-making processes. The two clear wins of where do we have common ground and what difference did our conversation make? So where you can see in the common ground stage first is where you have common ground, which actions are actually people ready to take, or they at least can live with them. They're not going to oppose them if other people decide to take them. And then lastly, there's also the blend of strategies that people feel are important. So if we have a Common Ground for Action forum issue called immigration, and there are three different options for dealing with immigration. One of them is based in kind of a valuing of diversity and our heritage as a nation of immigrants. One option is kind of based in a value of security, of both physical security and quality of life for people here. And then a last one is an economic, pragmatic take on the issue, kind of really looking at immigration as primarily an economic force. And so when you look at the blend of actions on which actions from which options were chosen in common ground, what you're able to see is the blend of strategies and basically the blend of values that people think are in play and that they are satisfied with for their decision. And the second big win in the Common Ground for Action platform is that participants are able to see the difference that their conversation make, which is not something that is necessarily always a part of public decision-making processes. But if you remember the last screen, individuals are able to see where they started off, their individual baseline preferences, where the group started off, and where kind of as a mass, where they would have been had you just kind of smashed all their initial preferences together like a poll or survey, and then where the group actually got to based on their conversation, how they changed. And lastly, the level of satisfaction that people would have with that blend of strategies. So it really shows people how they've moved. And if you have a person whose initial top five was not very close to what the group's final top five ended up being, and yet they are still highly satisfied with the result, that's a powerful argument for the legitimacy granting and the political permission expanding possibilities of common ground of this kind of a process.
Amy, we did experience that, and we saw in one of the forums we did where the initial choice of the group stayed solid. Now, we didn't do a lot of deliberation because we were very compressed in time, but one of the questions that I'm going to hope that the group asks, and I'm going to ask for them, is, in a sense, you do forums, now what? What does Kettering do in its role as an advocate or a promoter of democracy? What will you do with this data and these results?
Well, so there's a couple things that Kettering will do, and there's a couple things that are just the natural outcomes of the forums themselves, so that actually those outcomes exist in the citizens and the participants themselves. So what Kettering does is that we actually use this to better understand the citizen decision-making process and to talk to institutions and citizen groups about how to have better conversations, better decision-making processes. We also report lots of our findings to policymakers, where we let them know what will people really choose to do when push comes to shove. This is much, much deeper, more important information than you could gather with any kind of survey or poll. And Kettering does report that to policymakers. A lot of times, some of the people in our network who are actually conducting these forums in localities, and they may be talking about a national issue, but with a local kind of tailoring, will report it to their local, state, city, state, or regional folks and tell them what the results of those forums were. So there's also reporting out by participants themselves. But the big goals and outcomes of this overall are not necessarily just in terms of what Kettering reports to policymakers or what citizens report to policymakers. Basically, what Kettering is trying to do is by having more and more people participate in these, we want to have sounder overall public judgment. More participatory, yes, but also more deliberative, stronger decision making that is more right for the group of decision makers involved. We want to influence political discourse and problem solving so that we're not stuck in, so that the political culture is not so conducive of gridlock, that there are ways out of that when situations have become polarized and stuck. And we'd like to allow people, we'd like to have 1 million citizens involved in forums on both not only national issues forums, which we work on, but also their own locally framed issues, and for people to feel the sense of agency and the sense of competence that they know what is necessary to frame a problem in a way that will be productive. And lastly, one of the other goals that we have is to provide a verifiable record of public judgment that can be used to hold policymakers and other institutions that are part of our democracy accountable. So those are the not at all small goals of Kettering and the people and actually everybody who's involved in participating in Common Ground for Action forums.
Amy, one of the facilitators, Scotty, talked about some of the work that he's been doing with innovation games for kids. Is this something that Kettering thinks is only restricted to people who have voting rights, or does Kettering engage or endorse people who might be younger in this process?
Absolutely. I think the development of civic agency and the development of public problem solving skills is something that can't really start too soon. So, Kettering actually has done lots of work with college students, but we've also done work with high school students. And it's been found, actually, we're doing some work right now to talk about how the use of deliberative forms in classrooms really reinforces not only those 21st century skills that are parts of Common Core, and that help people to be stronger citizens overall, and they're very transferable to other disciplines. But also, the idea of deliberative skills and citizenship skills, these are better started sooner. There's nothing that happens when you turn 18 that really makes you suddenly able to comprehend the fact that there are competing things and that we've got to try to make a decision together about what we should do. And we know that people that start collaborating early end up being much more effective problem solvers and much more suited for solving problems both at work and in public life as they get older.
Amy, one of the phrases, and some of you have heard me say this, and I think Amy's heard me say this, is sometimes to play the game, you need to play a game, right? And I would say that if you guys thought about the sophistication of what you just experienced, you might need to run through something once to really like, okay, I get it. Now I know how to do this. Now I can play. Do you envision some possibility where citizens might play multiple forums on different topics, or that citizens might become more engaged and more politically active in this process?
We absolutely hope so. We think that one of the strengths of having Conteneo work with us to develop this is that we do think we have a very engaging platform that will have people wanting to come back and do this, not only because they know the importance of multiple issues in their life, but also because this is an engaging platform in which to do so. And they'll realize that there are kind of a class of problems that need to be discussed in this way, and they can see the usefulness and the transferability of that kind of talk. And so the idea that they would be able to not only do more forums on a variety of issues, but also develop this into possibly doing their own framings, maybe doing a Common Ground for Action forum on a national issue like immigration, or participating in one that's a statewide issue, like say bullying in Louisiana, if a state has just passed a zero tolerance law in their schools for bullying, and then possibly feeling that they actually understand how important the process is. And if they decide that they want to do a local issues framing for maybe a city issue, the fact that we'd like people to be able to feel that they not only want to participate in lots of these, but maybe to take on additional roles or to take on action coming out of the forums afterwards. That's absolutely a goal of this.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left before we take a brief break. Does anyone have any questions for Amy or for Kettering? One. You relate. Is this the only application of technology they're using? Amy, how technologically advanced is Kettering? Is this like the 15th tool that you've built, or is this the first one? I mean, what do you do? The question is kind of like, where are you in your embrace or use of technology at Kettering?
I would say that we are very, very early in our embrace of technology at Kettering, actually. Like I said, the forums that we have done with citizens for about 30 years have tended to be in person, and this is our first major. We did a couple of experiments with other kinds of forums a few years ago, but nothing that was nearly as engaging as this, or as widespread, or as far along as this. I think that at Kettering there's a slight, and this is a useful warning, not to throw tech at a people problem and think that technology can solve it. But I do think that here we actually have a really, really nice blend of using technology in a way that is useful to allow people to solve their own problems, rather than thinking that technology can do it for them.
Well, why not just fire up a chat on Facebook?
Um, because I think that, because there would be problems with, I think, kind of convening. What part of the things that you may not have noticed in your first run through of Strategy Engine might be the importance of the group that shows up and the convening that's in. We know that Facebook tends to definitely have a lot of like-minded people congregating together, whereas part of the moderator practice of Common Ground for Actions Forum is trying to have a diverse group when you start off with. Also, Facebook is, of course, not necessarily going to be synchronous. Lots of people are on Facebook all the time, but it could encourage people to check in, register their view, and check back out, and not actually exchange views, to post a few links to their favorite blogs and talking points, and just to argue with each other rather than to actually solve a problem. There's also certainly no way to see you're not starting with the framework that national issues forums or that anybody who knows how to do this kind of work can get you started with. And there's nothing, Facebook doesn't have an easy way of harvesting out and visualizing where there is common ground, which is the big win, obviously, for Common Ground for Action.
All right. Any other questions that we might have for Amy? Scotty. So Scotty has a question on how Kettering engages both in-person and online forums, in the sense of, you've talked about a moderator network and you talked about NIF, but how do people get recruited into participating in these endeavors?
That's a great question. So the NIF network actually operates on lots of different levels. It tends to be the basic nodes in the network are the moderators who invite people they know and also try to make these forums as public as possible by working with other nonprofits from a diverse group of kind of ideological backgrounds to make sure that they have diverse groups, by working with public organizations like libraries or colleges or other kinds of citizen associations. And we've also found that there are a lot of NIF moderators within particular pockets of our society. So actually, national issues forums are very popular in retirement homes. We even have a national issues forum chapter that works in the Pennsylvania State Prison system. The idea of civil rights for those kind of folks is actually a really, really intriguing one, the sense of civic agency for people many of whom have lost the right to actually participate in our standard political process. So basically, there are moderators who often act as conveners for people, and these things are as public as they possibly can be, but you are, of course, in person, limited by some of the problems of geography, bias, self-selection, time, all those things.
And our partnership is such that for those of you who are facilitators and want to learn how to facilitate in these public forums as part of your own personal philanthropy, you'll find that over time we will be granting credits from this platform towards your collaboration architect belt status. So what's going to happen is we're going to take the component of our systems that track your experience as producers and facilitators, and we're going to pull that out and make it a separate service. And then all of our platforms will be able to feed into that, possibly even opening up further. So if Kettering were for some reason to develop or have a relationship with another platform that solved a different kind of facilitation or collaboration problem, and you chose to contribute your energy into that, we want to recognize that energy. We want to recognize that contribution, and that will all work into your belt status so people know, wow, Scotty is not just a really good agile facilitator, or Nancy knows a lot of business facilitation, but she's been trained in moderation in common ground, and she can do social issues through this different process and this different flow. Now, that's not going to come immediately because our Q1 backlog is kind of set, but this is something that we hope to have happen in the next few months so that we can build up the network of facilitators. And then by closure, over time, as players become more engaged with innovation games, we want to make common ground available to the players of innovation games and build up the pool of players along all dimensions so that we can have engagement at a civics level too. And Kettering and Conteneo don't exactly know how that's going to work out yet, but that's directionally where we're headed together. Right? We don't exactly know, Amy? Not
We
yet?
don't exactly know, but we are both excited about
We're
it. I
both,
am.
yeah. Okay, any other questions before we, and thanks, Amy, for staying a little later at the office, but any other questions for Amy before we take a break? All right, thank you, Amy.